Some people, can't deliver the vocal well enough to not have to comp it together. Other people can't stand still enough that you're not getting phase shifting between the two mics constantly. But, it's always best for a singer to be standing. You're never going to go to the lyric opera and see someone deliver an aria in a chair. Your diaphragm and your lungs work better standing up.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Liz Phair, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Today's episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is sponsored by Roswell Pro Audio, maker of handcrafted microphones in California. Inspired design and impeccable attention to detail will help you capture a gorgeous vintage sound without the vintage price tag. Check out their beautiful line of microphones at roswellproaudio.com. Sending your music to be mastered can be scary, but sending your music to a total stranger for mastering can be really scary. Chris Graham is a Billboard chart-breaking mastering engineer with thousands of credits and knows how to make your record sound fantastic. But more importantly, he understands that there is one person that really knows what a great record sounds like, and that's you, rock stars. So if you're thinking about hiring professional mastering, but not sure if it's right for you, go to chrisgrahammastering.com and get a free sample mastering of your song. Go find out just how great your record can sound at chrisgrahammastering.com. Just click the link included in the show notes. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Liz Phair. Welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Brian Deck, a music producer living and working in Chicago. In their early 20s, Brian and college friend Brad Wood built Idful Music Corp, an under-equipped recording studio in Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood. Together, they recorded seminal records for Liz Phair, Red Meat, Shrimpboat, Tar, Sea and Cake, Tortoise, and other Chicago bands of the 1990s. Brian's unique musical aesthetic can be heard both as a player and an engineer-producer on the Moon and Antarctica by Modest Mouse, Shepherd's Dog by Iron and Wine, Somewhere Under Wonderland by Counting Crows, Animal by Margot and the Nuclear So-and-Sos, and All My Friends Are Funeral Singers by Califone. From Brian's own words in his bio, when not making music, he cooks, runs, dads, and tries to keep his old house from crumbling. I like that. Also, thanks again to Brad Wood for making the introduction. You can hear Brad's episode. He was a previous guest on the podcast at rsrockstars.com/95. Please welcome Brian Deck to Recording Studio Rockstars. Brian, are you ready to rock, man?
Ready as ever.
Awesome, dude. Well, I appreciate you sending me your bio, too. I pretty much quoted a lot of it right there. But I really dig flipping around through your discography and going and listening to many of the records that you've done. In this day and age, as I was explaining to you, I can kind of go to Discogs, find something that catches my eye, and just go over to YouTube or to Bandcamp or one of these places and immediately hear your music. And it's such a cool way to just sort of explore records that you've created. So thanks for sending all that. But let me ask you this. I've given a brief introduction. Tell us now more in your own words who you are and kind of how you got started out in recording.
All right. Well, Brad and I, to go all the way back, we met in college. We were both studying music majors. I was a percussion performance major. And our school offered 2 semesters of studio class. And you spent about, I guess, the first 5 weeks doing a lot of electronic theory, all of which pretty much went past me. I sure wish that I remembered that stuff now. And then, honestly, they just kind of set us loose in the studio. And so we did some fun stuff. I had a lot of fun in that studio. It was a neat studio. It had a 1-inch 3M M79 8-track machine.
Oh,
it
cool.
had I think it was a Studiotronics console. It's more or less like, an early American transistor console, transformer
back
balance.
when all consoles were sort of like a dark chocolate brown color.
Yeah, this one was dark gray, I think. But
Okay.
it definitely would be considered slutty by today's standards.
Where were you guys in school?
At Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, Illinois. So anyway, long story short, I spent some time in a nice studio, came out with stuff that was fun, but not particularly competent, and no skill whatsoever. There was no recording program there. There were very few recording programs anywhere back then. I think Recording Workshop in Chillicothe was a few years old. Full Sail, I think maybe hadn't even started yet. This was like 1985.
Yeah, I don't think it was on the scene till close to 90, right?
Yeah. And so I was getting closer and closer to graduation and realizing that I was not employable. I was not going to be a symphony player. I was not going to break into the studio scene as a drummer playing jingles in Chicago. And I thought the one thing that I could do was fake a resume and find a job in a recording studio. So that's what I did.
Nice. Were you studying drums at school? Was that your instrument?
I was a percussion performance major. So
Right. And that was Brad's study as well? I mean, I know he's a drummer.
Brad was I'm not sure. I believe he started out as a saxophone performance major, and then I think he switched later on to music education.
Okay, all right. I apologize. He probably told me already on the intro of his episode, and I've just forgotten specifically, but all right, so cool. So did you go straight to Chicago and look for studio opportunities right there?
That's what I did. I came into Chicago and I interviewed at just about every studio in town. And there were, Universal was still here with the infamous Foot Kirkpatrick, who had worked for Bill Putnam managing the studio. I interviewed with her. I interviewed at CRC. I interviewed at Streeterville. I interviewed, some of these places are gone. You won't recognize them anymore. But I ended up working at Chicago Tracks, which was ground zero for Chicago House, which was just being born right then. And so I spent an interesting year there.
Chicago House as in the EDM style?
Yes. I mean, EDM didn't exist back then. It wasn't a moniker. It was house.
Right. Exactly. What exactly is the derivation of house in the term? I mean, like, why do they call it house? Is it music that was for house parties originally, or is there some meaning behind that?
I think that is the entire meaning. It was music designed to make a house party fun.
Okay,
and
cool.
It had a slightly quicker BPM than your normal club music. Normal club music at that time was 120 BPM, and it was usually like 122 to 125.
Okay.
There was no particular songwriting involved. People would come in and lay down a beat and lay down a bass line. And if they had a sampler, they'd lay down some samples. A lot of people didn't have a sampler yet. A lot of people came in with little Boss sampling pedals and just would sample it. It was just important that you had a sample on there. And then if you're recognizable as a low bit, bad sounding sample.
Okay.
And then they'd have a house diva come in at the end of the day and just wail on top of it. It's, jack your body. And then someone would sort of, it was house mixing, I don't want to say dub mixing, but you'd set up some delays off of however many aux sends you had on the board. And it was all like muting faders and sending things into reverbs and delays and then cutting tape later on. This was all on tape.
Nice. So you guys would improvise a mix to tape, and then you might edit some of the best bits together?
Exactly, yeah. They'd do like 4 or 5 passes of just screwing around, muting and unmuting channels, and it was a lot like dub mixing.
Yeah.
And, dub mixing usually required a lot of tape editing at the end.
Well, this is a trip. I had no idea we were going to be talking about house music, but I'm really intrigued. So is that something that you really got into yourself? And did you ever get into the composing that? Or, I mean, despite saying there weren't really songs?
Yeah. I didn't personally get into it. To be honest, I was this white kid from the suburbs, having just moved into the city on the north side at this recording studio making house music that was total South Side music. I wasn't going to those clubs and I wasn't going to those parties. And so I wasn't really part of the scene, but it was super cool to see how it was done and relate it to stuff that I did know, like dub mixing. And, for instance, later on that same year, we started doing a lot of sessions with Ministry and Al Jorgensen, who had just returned from London, having done a whole bunch of work with Adrian Sherwood, who was kind of a superstar dub mixer back then. It was an easy transition from the house into what he was doing, and then from what he was doing into more kind of the songwriting approach of music that I had learned and cultivated.
What was some of the musical style that you were into as you were sort of leaving college and coming up to Chicago? What sort of music really turned you on?
It was very new wave. It was it was very mid 80s.
All right.
A lot of Cure. I remember during that year, Elvis Costello's Blood and Chocolate album came out, which really is not new wave, but that's how they sold Elvis Costello. And that record remains to this day one of my Desert Island discs. I think the production on that is amazing.
Nice.
Yeah, Bowie, Bauhaus, Tones on Tail.
So basically you are fascinated with the sounds. Were you a Thomas Dolby fan at all, or is that sort of pre-new wave?
I was a big Dolby fan. I loved his first two. I think I can't remember the name of his first EP, but his first two LPs floored me, you know, and I didn't know how that stuff was done.
So you were fascinated by the tech side of all this music, but you had an appreciation for more songwriting style that kind of paired up in the new wave scene. So what were some of the takeaways from doing all this house music that you were able to start incorporating and using into production? And where'd you go with it from there?
I was impressed with the improvisational approach to the recording studio, that people would come in with some amount of preparation, but literally no idea what it was going to sound like at the end. They knew what the BPM was going to be. They knew that there was going to be a 4 on the floor kick that was going to jack the house, but they didn't know what the song was going to be, and they didn't know how they were going to mix it. And I really appreciated that. I should also throw in that another correlation I was able to make was with My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, which was the David Byrne, Brian Eno record, which had been done, I didn't know it at the time exactly, but had been done in almost the same manner as all house music. They ended up calling it steady state music, which appeared in various interviews and then in David Byrne's book, what was it, How to Make Music or whatever, How to Listen to Music. But they would make and mix music in the same way. It was interesting to realize that what I was seeing done in the studio correlated to music that I already was a huge fan of, and that without understanding a lot of other things about how music was made, I could approach that.
Yeah. Well, was it like, how long did it take before you and Brad decided to just open your own studio? Tell us about the transition over to Idful Music Corp.
I worked at Chicago Tracks for a year and then took some time off because it was a punishing schedule. I worked 2 days and 2 nights each week, so I had to turn my schedule completely around twice a week. And, nice. a lot of time in between spent working as well. So I took some time off. Then I got a job at Chicago Recording Company. That was basically doing jingle stuff. I worked there about 6 months. During that time, I was kind of in a band with a bass player who had some 8-track gear and wanted to do some recording in his buddy's basement. And he invited me over to help him set it up. And I said, this would all work a lot better if we got a patch bay. We wouldn't have to dive behind the gear every time we needed to repatch something.
Yeah.
And, one thing led to another, and we decided to set it up as a studio and rent the space to do that in. In the meantime, Brad had also started working at CRC. And so we dovetailed time a little bit between building the new studio, which was Idful Music Corporation, and the time that we were winding down at CRC.
So what were some of the, thoughts that went through your head? I mean, you were in your 20s at this point, so had more enthusiasm than anything else, probably.
More enthusiasm than knowledge, more enthusiasm than money. That's for damn sure.
But you guys were just really excited about opening your own studio. Did you have a sense that this was even a doable thing, or were you just like, we just need a place to record the kind of bands that we like?
It was partly that. It was partly simply an opportunity that we, had this third friend now who had some gear And if all we had was the gear that he had, we would be able to set up and do stuff. Everybody knew that the first Eurythmics record was made on an 8-track machine.
Nice.
So
I like that there was already like studio lore going on at that point. There was the legend of your favorite record.
Yeah, which you would have to get through, Xeroxed fanzines and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
So this was at the... Go ahead.
We've brought up fanzines before, but can you just sort of like share an anecdote to kind of paint a picture of what that world was and Xeroxed fanzines for people who, only know the internet now?
It was the way that you would learn what was going on elsewhere, or even, in a different scene in the town that you're in. So here in Chicago, you would frequent Wax Trax Records. It was a record store as well as a record label. And they had a huge rack of fanzines right at the front of the store, and lots of punk and new wave kids standing there, annoying real customers, just reading these fanzines. And, you learn, I'm trying to think of a specific instance. I think it was an experience like that led me to buy my first Bauhaus record. I'm standing there reading at the newsstand at Wax Trax Records, and I see this band described in a fanzine. And I said, well, I think I have $12. That's what I'm going to do with it. And I would walk over and buy that. But you'd also learn about bands that you would see coming through the clubs in Chicago. And it was the only way of learning. You wouldn't learn much about, what was called underground music back then from MTV. There certainly was no internet, not much television covering this kind of stuff. So
it was very DIY, and I guess a fanzine ultimately implies that a fan of many bands might decide to put together their own magazine, and you literally just write it up on the kitchen table, go down to Kinko's, or do we have Kinko's back then? It might have been something else, but you just Xerox off copies and then just drop them in the mail and mail them off to different record stores or to people who had subscribed to it. That's
it. That's totally it. And
that's cool.
Yeah, sort of the pitchfork of the day.
All right. Well, so I apologize for derailing you there, but you were talking about fanzines, I guess, and just knowing that there was, I guess we were just talking about putting together Idful Music Corp. And
we're talking about Idful.
Of, why do it?
I was about to say that this was the dawn of the kind of prosumer audio era. And so we found some Flora demos at Guitar Center that we could buy cheap. We got a Tascam M520 mixing board and an MS-16 1-inch 16-track tape machine with DBX noise reduction, which I think in 5 or 6 years of operation, we probably aligned that thing twice.
Nice.
Yeah. If you want to hear the sound of DBX noise reduction being used wrong, definitely listen to our early work.
That's funny. I wonder if that's going to segue into some of my questions about the sound of making punk rock records.
I think it definitely will. I think that there was a certain brand of distortion that we got out of that gear.
Well, there's two bands that I listened to that made me kind of think of that topic. So one was a record by Red Red Meat, the Hot Nickety Trunk Monkey, great title. Mm-hmm. And the question I wrote after that was, how did you get that punk sound? Which is a very vague question, but I just wanted you to have sort of be able to comment on what that style of band was, what that style of recording session was, what it meant to have a sound that, for better or worse, it reminded me of a sound that if I heard that playing on a record in a music store, it would have just felt appropriate. It would have just felt like just the right kind of style for punk rock and fanzines. Do you have is that too vague a question, or do you feel like you can comment on what all that means to you?
Yeah, I think I can. Well, I can kind of describe the session because I remember it. That was the first session that I drummed on for them. I did not record it. Brad recorded it. We rehearsed maybe 3 or 4 times beforehand. It was very much a live setup. And Glynis, our bass player, had a large Ampeg SVT rig. So that was stuffed off into a closet somewhere.
Nice. And basically, when you guys played live shows, everybody could hear a lot of bass.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And then Tim and Glenn, their amps would have been stuffed off into another closet so that we could have room mics for the drums to get that kind of big room sound, which Brad and I were into back then.
Right. So at the risk of over-explaining, why is it important to stuff the amps in closets, therefore you can use room mics? Why can't you use room mics if the amps were just out in the room with the drums?
You know what? You can. And I kind of wish that we had.
Okay.
But there's obviously, if loud bass and guitar amps are in the room that your drums are in, they're going to be all over your drum mics.
Yeah.
And that's especially problematic if you have a large boomy room, which we did with a concrete floor, and bass. You know, bass doesn't like to stop.
Right.
Bass likes to keep on going. And
it likes to shake the light fixtures too.
Yeah. And so we would isolate amplifiers into other spaces so that the drum room mics didn't have much guitar in them at all. That way you could crush them with compression and get that kind of when the levee breaks kind of sound.
Nice. Okay, cool.
So what we would do, all early Red Meat recordings were very, very similar. We'd do a basic track like that, everyone at the same time with a scratch vocal. And the scratch vocal mic would be in the room with the drums, but that never really seemed to be a problem.
And you guys would be in headphones while you did all this stuff?
Right. And then the only overdubs we would do would be a vocal, and there was maybe occasionally a harmony vocal or like a group vocal of yelling or something. And then we'd bring both their guitar amps into the big room and mic them close, but also leave the room mics way up there. And they would basically those two guys would have a feedback freak out battle over the course of the song. And then you just ride those faders up whenever you wanted more complexity and more confusing noise.
Nice. And so that just kind of gave it an energy. What about frequency response? You know, if there's like a mid-range that seems appropriate for punk rock, where do you think that comes from in a record?
Well, I think it comes from two things. I think it comes from not overly refining your drums, using minimal miking, and having confidence in knowing that you're getting enough fullness out of minimal mics. So that, like nowadays, I'll frequently do drums with one or two microphones, which is something that we hadn't started doing yet at the time of Hot Nickety Trunk Monkey, but shortly thereafter we did. But we didn't have much facility to overly refine stuff and dump out a bunch of offensive, you know, lower mid-range and mid-range stuff. And so the sounds were in your face and aggressive and unrefined of the drums. And then, you know, guitars, I think, and that all comes down to taste. I think a lot of the character of one band over another comes down to, at least at that time, for guitar-based punk rock bands, you know, what kind of tone do you want? Television guitar tone was way different from like Sex Pistols guitar tone or The Jam or whatever. So in Red Meat, Tim had a custom with a K guitar head that was all solid state.
With the padding on the side of the cabinet?
He didn't have that one. He had the black Tolex one.
Okay.
And it was just raunchy. It would overdrive in a very solid state kind of a way. It sounded like a Tom Scholz Rockman box with a power amp attached.
Nice.
So that was his rig. And then Glenn, the other guitar player, had a classic Fender twin tube amp with a big muff. So they contrasted really well. And whereas Tim's solid state amp was very mid-rangey and aggressive, the other one was very kind of almost woofy and overdriven in a tube kind of a way. And they melded together pretty well.
Awesome. Well, I've been sort of leaping right into some of the deeper questions, but I apologize for skipping over some of my early ones. I like to ask guests to share an inspirational quote on the podcast. Have you got anything that you'd like to share with us to get us kind of excited about hitting the studio?
An inspirational quote from me or from someone else?
Whichever one you want. We just like to be inspired.
My favorite quote to think of when making music in the studio is a famous quote from Phil Spector asking Sonny Bono, "Is it stupid enough, Sonny?"
Nice. Was that an aggressive question from Phil to Sonny?
No, I don't think so. I think it was an honest question. Like when they were making those pop hits, they did not want complexity. They wanted something that was easily grasped immediately by, 99% of the world's populace.
So how does that play into your production? Do you feel like that's something you've known all along, or is that something you sort of discovered later?
I think because I'm a drummer. We mentioned that, right?
Right. So, right. What's the joke? How do you know if the drum riser is level or not?
The spit is coming out of both sides of the drummer's mouth. Yeah. So, drummers, I think, tend to be people who are drawn to complexity a little bit. It's a complex thing to do, to get your four limbs to play all together, but all separately at the same time. And you like to show off your chops, and you like to learn how to play, fucking Steve Gadd beats and stuff.
Right.
And so I think it's something that I learned to admit to myself that other people don't like.
Right. So this explains like the fills that there's when there are too many fills or the beat keeps changing around. This is sort of at the core of that.
Right. Yeah. So it just means, is it stupid enough, Sonny? Means, are we serving the song? Are we making the song compelling? Is this what's best for the song?
Yeah. And for the people.
I guess the people, yeah.
All right, cool. So thank you for sharing that. I like that quote. That's great. And thanks for bringing both Phil and Sonny onto the podcast. Let's go from, I don't know if it's really going from the punk rock approach to things, but I feel like the aggressive mid-range guitars, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we now go to Modest Mouse, for example, and you've done records with Josh Ritter, Joe Pug, Iron and Wine. Are these all records that seem to appreciate an acoustic guitar a little bit more? Would you say that's accurate?
Certainly, yeah.
So what was it like? What do you have to say transitioning from kind of punk rock sound to, this a little more appreciation for the acoustic, maybe fewer mics, and what does that all mean to you?
Well, I always appreciated the acoustic guitar and have seen and used various ways of miking it and representing it in mixes. And for me, that continues to evolve and understand, especially how to best use and how to best record an acoustic guitar in the setting of an electric rock band. That's not been easy to understand how to make it sit in there and really sparkle and work.
All right, hold up. How did you record Joe Pug, The Great Despiser, and what is the trick to recording acoustic guitar and vocal with a rock band? Sounds like we tapped into a good topic here.
Okay, that was a great session. Right around that time, I happened upon a technique where I would, for lack of a better description, distort the shit out of the acoustic guitar. If it's a strummy guitar in a rock band setting. So I would typically feed one mic preamp into a second mic preamp and just balance the gains back and forth, a little bit more of the one, a little bit less of the one or more of the other until I find a flavor that just kind of tickles me. And typically, in order to do that, you're going to have to be EQing some bottom end out because it's going to become so woofy from doing that. Mm-hmm. You're not going to have to use a compressor after that.
Was there any particular mic pre that worked well for this kind of stuff, or would you try this on with any tools you had in any studio?
I would do it anywhere. We had a Trident 80B that worked particularly well for that.
I like the 80B. To me, it's a great rock console.
Absolutely. We recorded and mixed the entire Iron and Wine Woman King EP on that console immediately upon having received it, before it was teched out, which turned out there was quite a bit that needed to be done to it. But
right.
Even an ailing 80B is a great sounding console.
Yeah.
So anyway, the trick to me for acoustic guitar was to get it not so that it sounded like an electric guitar, but distorting it in that way gave the upper mid-range a very sparkling and very solid kind of distortion that would cut through electric guitars really, really well. And I've used that ever since then. I've used it on the Gomez record. I've used it quite a bit with Counting Crows. So aside from the 80B, I've done the same thing with the UA 2610. That unit works really well, and it's kind of nice. It has a little bit more of a tubey flavor to it.
Yeah, is that the UA with two mic pre's in it, so you're able to just daisy chain them?
Right. And it's got very remedial shelving EQ that's helpful too.
Right. Remedial is good for all of us too.
Give me more than remedial and I will ruin your record.
Yeah, me too. Well, eventually here we'll talk about recording and mixing in the computer and all the plugins at our disposal and all that stuff. But what about the way that you know, like when do you add the acoustic guitar in recording against a full band like that? Do you try and track with the acoustic guitar and get the right sound? And how do you isolate it properly? What if you've got a singer who's singing at the same time? What are some things that would help us? And I like to refer to our listeners as the rock stars. So what would help the rock stars understand how to better track a band where you've got somebody singing and playing acoustic?
Right. If it's a fundamental part of the song, I would recommend that you track it live with the basic track. And if the singer is capable of nailing the vocal, I would highly recommend doing both at the same time. It's a little tricky. They have to stand still. Some people, can't deliver the vocal well enough to not have to comp it together. Other people can't stand still enough that you're not getting phase shifting between the two mics constantly. But
are you implying that they shouldn't be sitting, or just that in a rock band they are likely to be standing?
I've done it both ways. It's always best for a singer to be standing. You're never going to go to the lyric opera and see someone deliver an aria in a chair. And that's because, your diaphragm and your lungs work better standing up. That's how the human body works.
Well, very cool. So, all right. So standing, what about how often can that person be standing in the same room with the drums?
Totally depends on how hard you're beating the drums and what is the sound that you're looking for in the end. If it's Cowboy Junkies Trinity sessions, then you're cool. If you're working in a bad sounding room and the drummer plays loud, then it's probably not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're making your blues.
Do you have a sense of which way to go before the band you even put mics up for the band? Or do you sometimes just have to start one way and move the acoustic and the singer into a different space, and that's just part of getting started with tracking?
Yeah, you do all the preparation that you can. You do all the pre-production that you can. And quite often I think I know what I'm going to do, but it's important to remain flexible and admit to yourself when what you thought you were going to do isn't working, and then just change it.
Yeah.
If you get a whole setup going with a full live band and it took 3.5 hours, the last thing you want to do is walk out there and say, guys, I know that you've been waiting around all day to start recording this song, but this would work a lot better if I spent another 45 minutes changing this up again.
Yeah.
But, it's the right thing to do sometimes.
I try to impress this upon my interns and assistants here at the studio, that it's almost like the umbrella theory. The moment they take gaff tape and try and make all the mic cables look neat, is if they tape a mic cable down to the floor or if they run it under a carpet, it's guaranteed to need to be moved later on during the session.
Or they've doomed it to shorting out.
Or that, yeah.
So interestingly, for the Joe Pug record, first of all, he didn't sing live. But we didn't want a big room sound on the drums. We wanted a tight drum sound. And we were working at Engine Studios, which Brad built and I ran.
Nice. I mixed a record over at Engine.
Oh, wow. I wonder if I was there. When did that happen?
This would be in the late 90s or early 2000s. And I think we just mixed some songs, and it was for the Autumn Defense.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I wasn't there. That would have been in their first record probably, right?
Yeah. Well, it was and it was an Amec big console or something. I wasn't really a fan of the console afterwards. I don't know if it was one that, I just didn't quite, I was a little out of my league with it, jumping in and trying to figure out how to use it the first time. But it was one of these consoles that kind of did a lot inside. It was almost like It was very automatable.
You'll be happy to know that console was struck not once, but twice by lightning. And we replaced it eventually with the Trident 80B.
Oh, I like the Trident 80B. I like that one a lot.
But for the Joe Pug record, I recorded in the control room. So you were in a small control room at Engine, but we were in the big control room, and it was plenty big to get a really good drum sound.
Yeah.
So that was the only time I've ever done that, but it was really interesting. I set up right by the console, and I had an engineer in there working with me most of the time, Neil Strauch, but it was possible for me to hit record, turn around, and play the drums.
Oh, that's cool. I like that. I remember it being a really beautiful studio, too. You walk in, it was like, oh, this is a nice place.
Yep, I miss it. It's Audio Tree now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, so let's see here. What about some of the challenges of recording voice and acoustic guitar? If you have somebody singing and playing acoustic, are you pretty much making the decision that you may need to just simply re-record the acoustic and re-record the voice later? How often do you get to record both and keep just one of them?
I would say never.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah. I can't imagine pulling that off. Maybe if the acoustic guitar was going through an amp and you're miking the amp.
Otherwise, you're just going to get the voice bleeding on the acoustic or the acoustic bleeding on the voice. What about your double mic pre-trick? Is that something that you get to use when you've got somebody playing guitar and singing at the same time? Again,
it can be done pretty subtly. And so, yeah, I will do that. I'll even do it on someone who's finger picking, and you can, if you've got the two gains from the two mic pre's, and obviously if you're on a console, you can have the faders wherever you want them as well. So you've got a lot of flexibility with gain control, and you can get just a tinge of the distortion. And as it transitions into blatant distortion, you can get a wide range of stuff going on there. So, you're also talking to someone who distorts vocals on purpose.
You ain't afraid.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so let's transition from there back to one of my early questions too. Can you share a story about an important failure in the studio or in career, something that became a learning experience for you?
Yeah, I can. I got a couple things here that I could refer to. One was in that first year working at Chicago Tracks Recording as an assistant. There was a producer in recording a band. It was the Slam-and-Watusis, which was like
a great name.
Yeah, late 80s punk band here in Chicago. And they're trying to tune the snare drum to the song. And they couldn't understand. They thought they had it nailed, but every time they heard the snare drum in the song with the vocal and the guitars, it sounded really bad to them. I was so ignorant that it took me kind of a long time to even understand what it was that they were trying to do. But once I did understand what they were trying to do, I, with my diploma in music performance, strolled over to the piano, which was in proximity of the drummer, the guitar player, and the producer standing there discussing this. And I went, bum, bum, bum. Okay, the song's in E, and then ding, ding, ding. Oh, they're tuning that to, what would it have been? It would have been an A sharp. They were tuning it to a tritone.
Okay.
And they thought they were tuning it to the tonic, and I'm sure they were getting faked out by a harmonic. They were probably tuning a harmonic, but the fundamental of the drum that they were tuning it to was the absolute most disagreeable interval that they could have possibly been doing, and I knew that they did it wrong. And I just was like, Eureka, guys, I figured it out. You're tuning the snare drum a tritone off from the key of the song. And they looked over at me, I'm 21 years old, barely shaving. The producer looks at me and he goes, well, thank God there's someone here who knows something about music. And that sounds like a trivial little experience, but it made a huge impression on me.
And you got to keep working there after that too.
I can't remember how much longer I worked there after that.
But it brings up a thing that I think we've all gone through, and it's just when you're first doing this stuff, we all have to learn that, jumping in and enthusiastically offering our creative or advice or, a solution to a group problem, we think it's always a great idea. And it's only by doing it a few times and realizing, maybe even just one time, that it's really disruptive of the process. But it's that enthusiasm when you're young. You're just so excited about it. You just want to, like, you shared it as the most genuine, excited solution to a group problem, I'm sure, right?
I thought so, but I was unself-aware and I had no awareness of how it was going to be accepted by these people who were like right now kind of pissed off and very frustrated by the situation. And it taught me to go gently and make sure that I was respecting people as I was handling difficulties in the studio, which is always emotionally charged. And there's always ego involved in the creation of art.
Yeah. Yep. And the last thing you want to do accidentally is imply that somebody else doesn't know what they're doing.
Right.
And, I see that kind of thing happen in the control room. For example, there's this threshold in a session where everybody's a little tired and they're trying to figure it out. And the people who are supposed to be deciding what the harmony note is for the background vocal part are working very hard to come up with the right answer. And that's not the time for the intern to start humming harmonies out loud in the room at the same time,
Oh my God. Yeah, that's right.
It's somebody wanting to help, but not realizing that it's actually just making it harder for everybody to figure out what to do next. Unless you're directly asked. If you're directly asked, that's a great opportunity to come up with offer a suggestion.
But in order to get directly asked, you have to have inspired the confidence and the affection of the engineer, the producer, and the artist. And that takes some shutting up.
So you've made records for a long time now. I've been making records for a long time. Talk about now, how often do you still go through that where you're totally aware and you're sort of self-editing yourself and you intentionally shut up until it's clear that somebody would like your suggestion?
I try to remain aware of that all the time. And, I have strategies for explaining things nowadays, I think, and I have tested and true language that I use for explaining things. And it's also interesting that, you kind of encounter the same musical and personality problems in sessions all the time. Things don't change that much. Songs change and faces change, but the problems that you're solving tend to be very similar. And so, how often am I self-editing? Kind of all the time, as often as I'm with people, which is a lot less often these days.
What are you doing mostly these days? Are you doing more mixing, or are you sort of producing and editing just by yourself, or how does that work?
It's a lot of mixing, and I enjoy mixing. It's a great challenge, and I really enjoy receiving tracks that I didn't record. And it's the most important way that I learn stuff these days. I don't get to see it, made, but I get to hear things done in a way that I wouldn't have done it, and yet it shows up and it's working, and it challenges me to approach mixing in a different way. And so I do enjoy the fact that I'm sort of more focused on that these days, but I do miss working with people more often. And I think that this is probably, a lot of professionals in our industry are working the same way, because people are so empowered to do so much of the process themselves that, it's not uncommon to record the basic tracks, hand the files over, and not see the band again until it's time to mix.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my world, sometimes it's not uncommon to record the tracks, hand it over, and then hopefully notice on social media that they released the record and hear how it turned out, I mean, I've long since accepted that you can play an important role in a record, but it might just be one part of it, Although I do have a great appreciation for people who, are taking it from start to finish as a producer. I just think that a lot of times in the indie music scene, it's the artist, and maybe their friend who's producing that might see it from beginning to end. And I just, as a studio guy, now I built a space where it makes sense for somebody to come in and track the record and do some overdubs, but then take it back to continue doing vocals and mix it how they want. So let's see. Can we talk more about mixing? You've mixed, back when maybe you didn't know how to align the machine, you just pull up the faders on a console, and you're mixing now. What's the difference between mixing way back then and how you mix today?
Well, the obvious procedural things of mixing on a hardware mixer and the track's coming off a tape machine. I mix now on Pro Tools. I have the, what is that thing? The PreSonus fader port.
Okay.
I have one fader.
Nice.
Which I use basically for writing vocals and for doing other little rides here and there for guitars or whatever, because I think that I like the musicality of that tactile mixing. Back then on a medium to large format console, you'd frequently have to, get everyone present to help move faders. You'd number them, you'd label them. And I remember making cue sheets for myself and other people who were helping on the mix. And you'd put a piece of white tape next to the fader and make little marks. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're at number 1 for the intro, but you got to be at number 2 by the time the first pre-chorus happens and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember searching around trying to figure out if I could find that really skinny Architect tape that would actually fit in between the faders, and you wouldn't have to rip out shredded strips of masking tape.
Right.
But that was a fun process. It was a lot of fun, actually, being able to, it felt more like tracking the music, because when you're mixing it, you were still as a team, like both standing there, hunched over the console. Nope. Well, I don't know. Maybe you were sitting. We were almost, it seemed like we weren't sitting as much. We were standing up at the console, getting ready to make our moves. And then you get to the end and you all step back and you look at each other like you're proud of having just nailed that mix, hopefully.
It was fun. It was scary. There was a performance aspect to it. And if you were the one who fucked up and everybody had to do it again, and it was a difficult thing to do, there was pressure.
Yeah.
And it was fun. And sometimes you would mess up and you'd be like, you know what, but I think it sounded really cool. Let's take that out to the boombox in the lounge and listen to it. And you might decide to keep it.
Yeah. Do you think that mixing first takes had similar positive qualities to performance first takes?
Absolutely. And rough mixes that are less fussed over, but where you're very focused on like, what's exciting about this? What gets me excited about this song? That's maybe you're not consciously focused on that, but when you're just making a rough mix for the band to take home or whatever, you're throwing the faders up there and you're emphasizing naturally the things that get you jacked. That's a good mix. That's a good mix. And not fussing over, should I be dumping 2.5 dB at 300 on this kick drum? Is that better? Is it better just a dB and a half?
Yeah.
Fuck you, mix the song.
So back then you'd have the rough mix, hopefully you got in the habit of always just printing it. And unfortunately, that's era for me was all about printing to a DAT tape. So that was the place where all those mixes lived. But hopefully you were printing it, and then with each pass you printed it, and you'd end up with this collection of mixes. And, certainly if you were on analog tape, it was easier maybe to just edit those mixes together into something. Now in the world of Pro Tools, do you feel like we've lost that? Is there something that we need to get back as far as having a bunch of mixes of a song? Or do we just have one ever-evolving session and we lose the old mixes?
I try not to make value judgments and statements about how the world has changed because of digital.
Good.
Although
you should just shut me up with these questions.
Well, it's just different. There's a lot more intentionality, and you work on a mix until dinner time and you shut your computer off and you go do something and you come back the next day and you open it up and it's in exactly the same state that it was in before, and you can continue working on it. There's no improvisational aspect to it whatsoever. Very few people have a control surface large enough.
I was going to say,
really mix that way.
Your Pro Tools is working?
Yeah, hopefully it's working the next day, right?
I'm just kidding, but yeah.
Yeah, I thought I'd update my OS before I started work today.
There you go.
Bad idea.
All right, so you come back and you have those fresh ears and everything, and you can pick up where you left off.
Yeah, and so I think that it's different. And here's the thing, though. I was trying to reassess the way that I was approaching mixing and thinking some of the exact same things that you just suggested. And so I thought I suspected that if I went back through and listened to stuff that I still liked, from the beginning of my career to the recent, that I would find invariably that stuff that was done on analog consoles with analog tape was going to sound better. And as you know, even so far as the stuff on analog consoles without automation was going to sound better than the stuff with automation. Mm-hmm. And what I found to be true was that it had nothing to do with that. Some of my favorite recordings of all time that I had worked on and mixed were analog tape through an analog console. Some of my favorite recordings were, like Moon and Antarctica was one of my very first Pro Tools productions, mixed in the box incompetently. Nice. And I think that it still sounds awesome and people still like it.
That's Modest Mouse.
Yeah. And so I also found that my shit hasn't changed very much. Like my taste governing how I made stuff sound, as soon as I was able to kind of grasp that from, the later Idful days, like the middle to later period Red Meat stuff, until now, it's very similar, more similar than I'd like to admit, but it didn't matter what my tools were. I was making stuff sound that way.
Very cool. Well, so what are some things that, if I sent you a mix today and it had 33 tracks in it, what would be some first moves for you as far as how you would like to approach mixing?
I would listen several times.
To my rough mix or to the 33 tracks I sent?
Yes. All of the above. I would spend a lot of time listening and trying to understand the intention, and I would spend a lot of time talking to you and hopefully the artist and whoever else is part of the important brain trust, if it's a label person or it's frequently difficult to tell when you come to a project late.
You mean it's hard to tell who you have to make happy with this?
Yeah, I mean, you always have to make the artist happy. You don't know what the artist's relationship with the engineer and or the producer has been up until that point. You may or may not. Mm-hmm. You may or may not be clued into what label personnel or management are thinking, and it may or may not be important. But my point is that you try to discern that stuff, because you're going to have more success if you understand it than you will if you don't.
Yeah.
And so I listened to the rough mix a couple of times. I listened to the tracks. I look at how it was done, because usually the plugins are still there, although I frequently don't have half of what other people are using.
Right. Well, that answers that question. You don't feel compelled to have every plugin under the sun necessarily to open up somebody's session.
No, I do not.
All right. And it would be hard to do anyway, because a new plugin comes out every, week.
Yeah. I mean, what are you going to do, really? And there's so much, if you want to get me going about plugins, there's so much emphasis on slutty, sexy, analog-looking graphic user interfaces that will dupe you into thinking that you're hearing something that sounds exactly like an LA2A.
Right.
But whether it is or it isn't, it's hard to tell if you're not actually A-Bing it with the real thing. Is the only real thing that you've ever known the reissue? That sounds real different from one from 1957 or whatever.
And in the end, I guess the only thing that matters as far as sound is whether or not it sounds like what the artist intended when they were trying to create this musical part.
Exactly. Ask an artist how many balancing transformers and line amps they'd like their signal to go through by the time they don't know or give a fuck.
Dig it. Well, so all right. So you listen to the stuff. Do you find that there are some go-to ways to arrange your Pro Tools session that sort of typically usually make sense as far as, what do you do with, let's just say I've sent you drums, there's 10 or 11 mics. Let's say I've sent you bass, guitars, and vocals. What are some general things that would be helpful for the rock stars to understand about setting up a session for a mix?
A lot of people might be horrified to hear that after I've done all this alleged understanding of the situation, if there's not something instantiated that is absolutely imperative to making the vibe of the song, and frequently there is, a certain guitar effect that's got to be there, and I have to get that plug in, but also frequently there isn't. I will tear it down. I'll tear down the whole mix. I'll unsubstantiate all plugins. I'll get rid of all automation. and start to build it from scratch again. I've always got the rough mix there to A/B it with. My next step is to tear it down.
Yeah. I feel like an analogy for me is when I go from tracking and we're switching into overdub mode, sometimes there are some overdubs where I can keep the tracking set up and kind of go right into overdubs, but usually it works better for me to just clean up the studio again and like switch gears into overdub mode. And I feel like that's similar in terms of mixing. Like it would be kind of a mind fuck to have to keep all the preciousness of all this complexity in a mix somebody sent you and work on top of that all the time.
Yeah. And I've usually discussed that with the artist ahead of time. I've usually told them, I'd like to receive the rough mix file with as few playlists as possible so it's not bogged down and slow.
How about none?
Yeah, right. Yeah, how about just the one? If you need something recomped, go ahead and recomp it and send it to me when you're done. But yeah, don't print effects. Don't leave effects instantiated. Don't automate anything. And then there will be less for me to have to undo. And you're right. It's time for a palate cleanse. It's time for an objective ear. I mean, if you're going to pay someone to mix your record who's been heretofore uninvolved, there must be a reason you're doing that.
Yeah, and if you hear something on that initial listen that, again, sounds like it's really defining of the sound or the attitude of the record, you can always even just bounce the drums and have them on a stereo reference track in your session and still rebuild it,
Yeah. Yep. Good point. I should do that more.
What about the stuff that you get sick of doing over and over again in a session? Do you like to import a number of effects and just sort of have like this, almost like the right side of your console, you just bring it all in at once? Or do you approach things and as you come across the vocal, you start thinking, oh, I'd like to hear this effect on it, and then you just create it and add it? What's your attitude towards that stuff?
I think that it changes from project to project. And if something arrives to me and it's a band-based project, or even if it's a singer-songwriter, but they employed the same rhythm section in a fairly short amount of time to record all the songs, and it's all recorded the same way, then I'll take that as an implication that it's supposed to be mixed to have kind of a band sound. And so, yeah, after I establish what that's going to be in the first couple of mixes, I'll import the plugins into the subsequent mixes and use that as a starting point, although I'm still going to change things to suit the particular song, like, compression, attack, and release. And, the drummers are going to be changing cymbals and changing snare drums and maybe changing bass drum beaters and stuff. So you got to keep your ears open and adjust. And then also when it comes to the vocal, people will usually record a lead vocal the same way throughout an album. Sometimes they don't. They're going around to different studios and they don't have the same gizmos and the same mics.
Right.
But usually it's the same, and I try to find that out. And
over 100 episodes of the podcast, by the way, and it's the first time somebody said gizmos, so thank you for doing that.
I'm proud of that. I'll own that. So, it'll take me probably 2 or 3 mixes to really get to where I feel like I'm working with that well. And then I'm usually going to go back and revisit those first few mixes where I didn't have it figured out as well.
Yeah.
And I'm talking specifically about EQ and compression on the lead vocal track. I will import that from song to song, but when it comes to vocal effects, that's determined on a song-by-song basis.
Okay. And then if you have sort of a widening effect or a delay, would you typically make a new aux track, pull up that delay plugin, and then you might have some presets in there that are some of your favorites, and that's a starting place? Or would you import a track that already has the effect on it with certain presets ready to go? Are there any tricks for that work well for you?
Right. I don't work with templates, so I don't have stuff like that all ready to import, but I do have in mind as I'm working through a project, that particular effect worked great on that song 3 songs ago, and I think it would work great here again. I will import that aux track. Pardon me.
Right. So
gastrointestinal distress.
Well, you live in the land of sausage shacks in Chicago, and all that. So you're forgiven. But you say you won't use templates when you're mixing, but I imagine that after you begin to understand the first couple of songs of a record, do you feel more comfortable bringing in the settings from the last song you did to begin the next song?
Yes. I'll just say yes.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what I've found as well, too, which makes sense. Sometimes it makes it challenging to have an assistant help because the only way is for them to sort of be there right at that moment. If I want to step away and have them just sort of get the next song started for me. Mm-hmm. But I'm with you on that. I want to take a break here and we'll come in for the jam session. But what have I not asked you about that you'd like to talk about just before we do that? Do you want to talk about, Modest and Mouse session, Iron and Wine session, Counting Crows? You've done a lot of great records. We haven't even brought up Liz Phair yet.
Oh, that's another disclaimer. I never worked on Liz Phair.
There you go.
It happened at Idful, and I was around a lot, but not my client.
Well, you built the studio.
Yeah,
you built the studio where it was recorded. That's part of the sound. Tell us about working with, Iron and Wine. What was it? I had written down Woman King. Was that one of the records that you did as well?
Yeah, I did Woman King. And like I said, it was the first thing we did on that Trident 80B console when it was delivered after the lousy AMEC was struck by lightning the second time.
Now, was this a record that sort of made a blend of live performance, but also used loops and things like that?
Let's see. It was definitely, so the first record I worked on with Sam was Endless Numbered Days. He brought his whole live band along with him, and but it was still tracked piecemeal, one element at a time. It was not very sonically adventurous.
Let me interject a question.
Yes.
When you have a band and yet you feel like the songs need to be, for the record to sound right, it needs to be tracked piecemeal, one piece at a time. What are some thoughts that seem to work well as far as how do you integrate, a band performing, but also recording in the studio one bit at a time? Can you comment on that?
I would say that at that point, working with Iron and Wine, that wasn't my decision or problem. And Sam brought all these people along with him to make contributions, but his comfort zone, having made Creek Drank the Cradle on a cassette 4-track machine by himself, was working the way that you had to work with a cassette 4-track machine by yourself. And so we had spoken ahead of time about not wanting to do things that were going to confuse people who loved his first record. And we wanted to keep certain things about the procedure similar toward that end, and also because he just knew it would work, and we didn't have very many days to record it. I think we made that record in 10 days.
Nice. Start to finish.
Yeah. And so and then
you partied on the 11th day.
That's more or less true. I think we might have partied on the 9th day.
Well, my question was a little bit loaded. When you are producing and when you are making the decision, do you find that, for example, there's a lot of power in having a live band in the studio, even if you're not going to keep everything that they play live? In other words, do you have a band play so that you're getting the arrangement right and the way it all kind of comes together, but then you go back in and still replace each element and now it works as a result of that? Or do you find that the opposite is true?
I've done quite a bit of the former. I think that the best possible way to make music is together with people.
Yeah.
Without a click track. And that's how I try to work these days. And I've witnessed it done so incredibly well that it gives me shivers. And it's happened all along. It happened, I'm going to blank on the name of the song. Stars Are Projectors off of the Moon and Antarctica by Modest Mouse. That's like almost a 9-minute long song where those guys jammed it out. We tried it several times that day. It hadn't come together. We decided to take one more try before we decided to go home that night. Turned all the lights out, got the mood right. And they did that. And there's a shitload of overdubs that happened after that. More voices, more guitars, percussion, atmospherics, reprocessing of the drums. But it was all right there encapsulated in the original performance. And I remember me and my assistant just being blown away at the end of that for that 9 minutes of the basic track. That, to me, translates to the record. I've heard the Josh Ritter Band do that. I've heard Counting Crows do that. We cut almost the entire record for Iron and Wine's Ghost on Ghost live, where he was singing the lead vocal live on almost every song. More shivers, that's the stuff that I think really actually does translate. You have real communication going on, people reacting in real time to what each other are doing musically, performing dynamics together, pulling this off together. And when it's done really, really well, there's not a lot that needs to be done mixing later on.
I remember having this epiphany some years ago where I realized that music to me was human beings communicating to each other. And I feel like that's what you're talking about right now. Big
time. And if it's done in a piecemeal fashion, we had to work toward that with Iron and Wine. When you're making a record by yourself in the bedroom, that's a certain vibe. It's very contemplative. It's more intimate, but it's a conversation, but with yourself. It's a meditation. It's a meditation. That's the word I was looking for. And to me, that's less compelling than music that is communication between more than one person. Yeah, interesting. And then when every subsequent overdub after that is it's a human versus the computer. Right. Yeah. And can obviously we all dig that on a certain level. If you go back far enough, you were appreciating new wave and electronic stuff. But on the other hand, our appreciation of the technology can also leave us sometimes feeling a little bit like something's missing. And when we get that chance to go work on with a live performance, and all of a sudden you feel that intangible energy. Well, no, I guess it is tangible, but you just feel that thing. It's a reminder of how powerful it is to just hear live music being played. Yeah, totally. There's a few artists who've been able to do that. Stevie Wonder had a string of records that he made mostly all by himself in the 70s that stand up and sound inspired and full of energy. Prince obviously did a bunch of that. But for the most part, I find records that are done by one person alone to be lacking in energy. Interesting. Well, let's take a break. And that's a deep topic to go out on here. We'll take a moment. We'll come back in for the jam session. Thank you for being here on the podcast with us, Brian. Rockstars, you're going to find links to all the stuff we're talking about in the show notes. For example, the Stars and Projectors song. We'll see if we can find that and drop in a YouTube link as well, so you can go check out exactly what Brian's talking about. And the show notes are available right on your iPhone, right on your Android. You can just click through. No need to type while you're driving. And we'll see you guys in a moment for the jam session. Thank you. Roswell Pro Audio brings you microphone design that is out of this world. Endorsed by a growing list of artists and producers like Phil Collen of Def Leppard, Ross Hogarth, who's recorded Van Halen, Ziggy Marley, and the Doobie Brothers, and Super Dupes, working with Drake, Mary J. Blige, and Eminem. These are all rock stars that have discovered just how great Roswell microphones sound. Check out the Mini K47, which uses a capsule modeled on the one in the vintage U47 at a street price of only $299. Or the beautiful Delphos condenser microphone with a capsule tuned like the vintage U67 with great clarity and far lower noise at a street price of only $899. In fact, you are hearing my voice right now on the beautiful Delphos microphone. These mics are carefully crafted by hand and immediately feel good even before you plug them in and hear how great they sound. These are well-built microphones that will last you and your studio a lifetime of great recording. Check out more audio examples of these awesome mics at roswellproaudio.com. Are you thinking about hiring professional mastering for your song or record? Chris Graham is a Billboard chart-breaking mastering engineer who has mastered thousands of songs for both pro and home studio clients just like you.
Send in your song and Chris will give you a free sample master of your mix. Book a project with Chris today and also get a free video mix consultation before mastering. This will help make sure your mixes are the best that they can be. So go to chrisgrammastering.com today and get your free sample started and your record finally finished. Just click the link included in the show notes. Hey, rock stars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Brian Deck, joining us from Chicago. And Brian, are you ready to jam?
Yes, I am.
Awesome, dude. When you started out in recording, what was holding you back?
Well, technically, understanding signal flow and gain staging. Sounds really simple, but I had a musical education. I didn't have a technical education. And so just getting the signal from the microphone to the recorder was pretty challenging for me.
Did you discover a way to make it easier for you to do it? Or you just practice?
It was literally the idea of tracing where the signal was going to go. You know, it's coming out the ass end of this microphone. I have to connect a cable from here to the wall. And then I have to make sure that whatever's coming out the other side of the wall is going into a thing that makes that microphone louder. And you know, whatever else I go through, I have to trace the path and make sure that it ends up going to the tape machine. And then I have to see that meter jump. And then I have to make sure, literally, that the wire that comes out of that channel of that tape machine is coming back to a fader on the console. You know, I know that that's tedious, but that's what I had to think through.
Did you have to navigate a patch bay at that point too, or was that later on?
Yeah, at Idful, we had two patch bays. We had a patch bay at the wall that would connect mic lines to the console. So you could, you know, if you plugged into input 10 in the live room, you could still have that hit input 3 on the console if you wanted to. So we had to configure that with every session, and then, you know, a patch bay for everything else.
So patch bay after that would be insert sends from the console going out to gear and going to the tape machine and stuff.
Right. Yes.
So I remember, you know, I guess I was probably 25 at that point, actually. But my first time in a studio making records under pressure, I tried to keep up with the band and, you know, their attitude towards beer and smoking pot. And I quickly realized after getting high with the band once and looking at the patch bay, there was no way in hell I was going to be able to do that from then on. That was it for me. So I adopted a sober attitude towards the studio from that point on, at least until the work's all done. Because that will serve you well. Yeah, I could not. I looked at the patch bay and I just started melting. You know. Right. Yeah. It's funny. It's sometimes a tightrope you have to walk because the client wants to know that you're a person they can hang with. Yeah. But they also want their shit to sound good. At the end of the day, when they go home and it rocks, you're going to get some credit for that. And if it sucks, you're going to get some blame for that. Yeah. You'll be getting credit for that too. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, so how about sharing some of the best advice you received? Don't smoke pot with the band in the studio. Yeah, right. And I just got that, and I'm like, oh, geez, that's it. No, I think the coolest piece of advice I ever got, I actually got through Tape Op magazine, and it was an interview with George Massenburg. It was a short one-page interview from years ago, and I'm willing to bet most people didn't even notice it. It almost looked like an ad that you just flip past real quick. But in it, he was asked what is his best advice for young people in the recording industry. And he said, remember whatever it was that got you inspired and excited about music in the first place. Nice. Remember that situation, that listening environment. Now go find a room that is approximately the same size and set up a listening environment for yourself that's very similar to that can be your control room. Put your gear in there. Listen to those records that got you really excited in that space so that you understand what they sound like there. And then get busy making music that sounds like that. I'm trying to think of what that would be for me. Is probably like high school dormitory, you know, having a first component stereo with the turntable. Right. And earlier than that was my clock radio in my bedroom growing up. And Embarrassingly, the first song that I remember sort of knowing and wanting to hear again was Lunatic Fringe, which would show up, which would play
Nice.
on, with my alarm clock. So I don't know if that's really where I need to go back to and get inspired again, but maybe it is.
Well, I don't think that inspired you to be a recording engineer. I'll bet it was a little bit later than that.
Yeah, it was a little later than that. I think when I think of first inspiration, actually, I think for me, it had more to do with what you described before, which was playing music with other people, being in a band and the feeling that went around that, and then listening to records as well,
Right on. The thing that impressed me about this Massenburg quote is that this is a guy that holds like probably several dozen patents. He teaches, he's an amazing engineer. He's a gear designer, an acoustic designer. He's like one of the most accomplished people in the industry. And this was his advice, like get jacked up and do something that's going to make you excited.
Yeah.
Stay inspired. It's really about staying inspired.
You do your best work when you're inspired.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So now how about sharing a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that the rock stars could use on their next session today?
I discovered bus processing. Nobody ever showed it to me or explained bus compression or bus EQ, but I discovered it because I was working with a band that had to mix the whole record in one day. I think it was a budget thing, or they had to leave on tour or whatever. We had to mix a whole record in one day. And I'm like, how in the fuck am I going to do this? Because I usually put individual compressors on all the drum channels and all this crap. And faced with this dilemma, it occurred to me that I could use the buses on the console and I could just route all the drums through one stereo compressor and get more or less the sound that I'd been getting otherwise. I swear to God, no one had ever told me that you could do that before. Now everybody does it all the time. But bus processing is your friend. If you're working on a hardware mixer and your tracks sound a little dull, put an EQ across the stereo bus, brighten the whole thing up, turn it into a bright console, and then just mix. You can mix so much quicker if you are making sure that at the summing stage, things are being processed in a way that you intend to be doing it anyway. And validation of that concept came years later when the Record the Beatles book came out, and I finally understood that they compressed the shit out of everything, like 5 or 6 times. Every time they would bounce it down, when it was being recorded in the first place, and when they mixed it down, everything was being cranked through Fairchilds with probably like 3 to 6 dB of compression.
That's a trip. Yeah, and that's why it sounded so in your face all the time.
And I loved it. I always loved that, but I was taught, be very careful with compression. That's going to screw up your sound and cause phase canceling.
Right. I feel like that was another reason why fewer instrument parts could add up to a really full sounding, pop mix for the Beatles too, because of that. Each sound was pretty exciting in and of itself.
Right. Actually, that whole thing that you just said is a much more important concept for people to understand. Record less stuff with less microphones.
And make less stuff mo better.
Yep.
All right. When you're mixing now, do you start with something on the 2-bus for yourself when you're working in Pro Tools? Do you like to start there and just make sure you have sort of what feels like your digital console before you start addressing the individual elements?
It depends a little bit how I'm doing it, because I do have a little summing situation here at my house. I have... what is this thing? It's an old Electrodyne 8-channel rack mixer. I can't remember the number of it. But it has shelving EQ on it. It's fairly severe, so it goes from being neutral sounding to pretty bright sounding in one click. But sometimes I'll decide to do that, and then I've got 8 channels of summing to work with there. But if I'm working in the box, I'll definitely start without 2-bus processing. But before I finish, I'm going to instantiate some things. Probably a little brightening and definitely some compression. And I think you want to do that before you start writing automation, before you start doing fades and stuff, because the way that it will sound reacting to a compressor on the 2-bus it's going to cause you to ride that fader differently.
Yeah. Well, another mixer friend of mine here in Nashville, Jamie Tate, described his mixing process to me once. He said he would, use an SSL compressor across the two mix, but he would always leave it in bypass until he was pretty far into balancing out the whole mix, because he felt like it got him to work harder towards getting a great mix before he started adding that stuff.
I would agree with that.
All right. So now how about sharing a favorite hardware tool or something that you're just always glad you've got it, something physical on a session?
I'm tempted to say Yuri 1176s because I do love them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, honestly, I worked for so many years without having all that kind of holy grail gear to work with. And a lot of that stuff still stands up to me. I'd say having really simple, transparent, non-transformer balanced mic pre's and compressors forces you to make really good decisions about what microphones you're using and where you're putting them. And
so non-transformer means it's going to be less of a colored sound?
Correct, yeah. And, people are kind of all about that these days, to the point where you're using, software emulation of the real thing
right
in your mixes constantly. But I think you make more musical, better engineering, fundamental decisions when you're not starting from a colored place that you don't even know you're starting from.
Yeah. Well, do you feel like by default with these digital boxes that have built-in mic pre's, most of us are getting a leg up in that department, like where we're starting out with something that's pretty high quality and pretty uncolored? Or do you feel like that's not true?
I think that it's true. I think that, I'm speaking to you right now through the uncolored, electronically balanced microphone input of my UAD Apollo 8.
Right.
But
so
they've also made it quite possible to instantiate plugins that will put a bullshit Neve with a bullshit Mayfair transformer in front of it.
Nice. I was going to say, we're getting a transparent rendition of that nice colored Shure SM57 that you're using for your vocal mic, right?
Most versatile microphone ever made.
Yeah. It's the only microphone, well, I don't know if it's the only one, but there's this great letter from the president of Shure where it's the recommended microphone for all the presidential speeches. And he's supposed to use a pair. That's why there's always, or she is, that's why there's two microphones up on the podium.
Ah.
They're both SM57s.
Not always.
Okay, maybe not always.
Ronald Reagan used an Electro Voice RE12.
Oh, did he? All right.
Yeah.
Well, there goes that theory. I guess I just fell for the PR stuff that I was seeing from Shure. How about sharing a favorite software tool for the studio or something you're excited about that you want to share with the rock stars?
I don't know how long ago it came out. I started using it within the past 12 months. The FabFilter Pro-Q 2 is the best fucking thing ever. It is so useful.
It's really good. I use it a lot too. What are some of the things that it does that you really appreciate?
It has a real-time frequency analyzer, which lets you see what you're hearing and teaches you things about what it is that you're hearing. It's an interface that's intuitive and takes advantage of what's unique and good about computer interfaces instead of putting a bunch of knobs up there and a fake VU meter that tell me nothing.
Right.
So I love that. I love the metering. I love the middle side processing that it can do.
Yeah. How about some of the EQ settings? There's the low latency, the natural phase, and I forgot what the other one is.
The zero latency.
Zero latency, yeah.
Yeah. So they're subtle. The differences between zero latency and natural latency are subtle. I think it's there to, zero latency is has no phase shift, I guess.
Or just no latency, no delay on the track with the plugin. But I feel like that's not there anyway, so who knows?
Yeah, I think it has more to do with phase shift. I think they're referring to phase shift there.
Okay.
But the natural latency introduces the phase shift that you would get from an analog EQ. And I don't know if that's based on inductor style EQ or fully parametric style EQ or whatever. But I do hear a difference, and I frequently, a lot of times I don't know which one I'm going to like better in the track. But sure enough, I figure it out just by going back and forth between them. The other one, what's the third one called?
It's the phase accurate or something like that.
Right. But I've used that mastering. If I put it on the 2-bus, I'll use that and just believe them it's better.
Now, there's also some features on the Pro-Q too where you can hover over the RTA, the real-time frequency response, and then it'll kind of do this white line on top, and then you can go click and pull down. So it kind of freezes different peaks, EQ peaks. Do you ever mess with that at all?
I haven't really gotten into that thus far. I realize that it's there, and I accidentally see it happen sometimes, just because my cursor is over the line. Mm-hmm. I haven't figured out its usefulness for me yet, although having the analyzer going is extremely useful.
Do you sometimes use the solo, the frequency band feature that's there as well? Maybe you already know mentally, you've internalized all the solo tones of all frequencies already.
Yeah, I don't do that, and I don't know how useful I'd find that to be.
What about starting with it? Because sometimes I find it's such a blank slate that it can be a little daunting as far as where to start. Do you like to start with it in the 7-point mode where it's already got a low shelf and a high shelf, and then it's got a few, 5 bell curves in the middle?
First of all, when I instantiate an EQ, it's because there's something I'm about to do, something I need to do, something I've identified with the sound that I need to do to it.
Okay.
It needs to be brighter, or it needs to be more aggressive, or it's too muddy, or there's a lot of sub, and that's going to cause a problem with the compressor or something like that. And so I'll instantiate factory default with no EQ points and just make them as I need them.
Okay, cool. I like that approach. It's like, don't just automatically start doing stuff. The whole point of using the Pro-Q and not using a transformer mic pre was to not automatically mess around with things.
Right.
All right, cool. So let's jump forward to the next question. Brian, let's go to sharing a resource or a tip for the business side of doing this. If somebody doesn't just want to do this for a hobby, do you have something they might want to know about or any advice?
I'd say that it was super pivotal for me when I started working with a producer manager with whom I had real good dialogue, who understood me well. And he refined my understanding of my ambitions and helped me know that they were achievable and that he could explain to me how to achieve some of them because he'd done it before. So what I'm trying to say here is get help from someone who's good at it.
Nice. How did you go about finding somebody to get help from?
He found me.
All right.
Yeah, I had done a bunch of stuff, and I had been working with a different producer manager. That relationship was not very helpful or healthy, and I was truthfully considering packing it in, or at least taking some time off. Shit wasn't going that well for me. In the meantime, Endless Number Days came out, and Andy Kipnis from AAM heard it and thought that it was a great record and had a particularly unique and good approach to the vocals. And he called me and introduced himself and told me that that's what he thought of that record and would I be interested in working together. So I got lucky, and it wasn't a low profile record. I got lucky to be able to make that record. But, I'd already done other not low profile records and been sort of not achieving. And it took someone's help to get there. It took the help of someone who'd done it before and who understood how to do it.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And what was his name again?
Andy Kipnis, Kipnes.
All right, cool.
At AAM, Advanced Alternative Media.
Right on. All right, well, so let's jump to the next one. How about an organizational tool or resource, something that helps you keep your shit together?
Right. So I've got two. One of them, I just learned about it, so I'm not super great at using it yet, but it's called Basecamp, and it's project management software.
Yeah.
Do you use it at all, or do you use something
I've looked
similar?
at it in the past. I use something called Asana, actually, to keep the podcast organized.
Okay. So it allows you to keep a common calendar with the client and the entire production team. It allows you to update mixes, and for that matter, track contributions if you're not all in the same location. And it allows you to keep on schedule. On each page of Basecamp, there's like a chat room.
Nice.
So you can make notes back and forth. And the whole thing's on your phone. It's pretty awesome, and I'm just getting into using it. I've been told that it's going to revolutionize my time in the studio, and I hope that that's true.
That's very cool. And I think it does things like Gantt charts, for example, which will allow you to sort of see the way the project is laid out over time from beginning to end, and if you're still on schedule. Now, I'm not an expert about using those, but it's the kind of thing that I've seen before that looks intriguing as well.
Right, which will allow me to stop using the marker board at the back of the control room.
Well, I don't know, man. Marker boards are pretty cool.
They're usually covered with band graffiti by the time we're done, which is pretty cool.
It is cool.
But the other thing that I have to tell people about, it's a plugin called RIN-M, RIN-M, by a plugin manufacturer called Soundways, and they were profiled in Tape-Op a couple issues ago. People have to start doing this. It's a way to track everyone's contribution to the making of a record from the beginning to the end and maintain that metadata cross-platform so that we can start to get credits and start to get paid. And the DDEX brain trust that exists between Apple, Amazon, Pandora, Spotify, the Recording Academy, RIAA, I think might be part of it. I'm not sure who all is part of this brain trust, but they're in the process of getting all the major labels to commit to requiring this metadata standard be attached to all of their files, and having it as a platform agnostic plugin that can be instantiated in any DAW right now is a huge step in that direction. Yes.
In fact, we just had Gabriel Waddell on the show from Soundways to talk all about RIN-M, and he explained it, and he was a great guest. And then Kevin Becca from Mix Magazine to also talk about it as well. So I'm glad to hear you bringing that back up. And Rockstar, as a reminder, if you listen to those episodes, you may have already gotten a copy of it. But I did make a link at rsrockstars.com/RIN, R-I-N. And if you go directly to that link, which we'll include in the show notes for this episode as well, you can download the free book from Kevin that explains how to use it and get a copy of the plugin as well. And we may still even have a discount over there. You have to go check that out. But thanks for bringing that up again. I think it's really cool, and I just started using it on the past couple of records I've done. And do you have any tips for using RIN-M? Have you already run into a couple of ways to sort of import your data or understand how to put your profile in and have it show up again easily? Any of that stuff?
No, I'm not there yet. I just learned about this about a week and a half ago, just downloaded it last week, and I'm totally amped about the concept of it and the necessity of maintaining the data for credit's sake, but I don't have enough personal experience.
Well, we'll all invent it together, rock stars.
That's what we're here for.
All right, so last couple of questions. Brian, these are both hypothetical. This one, imagine you're starting over and you don't have your studio and all this stuff that you've done before, but you needed to put together a simple setup to record. You needed to find people. Maybe you're in a new city somewhere. You need to find people to record, and you need to make ends meet while you do all this. What would you choose, or what would you advise to somebody else?
All right. Well, from a gear perspective, I'm kind of a creature of what I already know. So I would have a MacBook Pro and a UAD Apollo 8 as an interface. I like the sound of the interface. And obviously, it gives you access to UAD plugins, which, as much as I am annoyed with the sluttiness of the interface, they sound great. I'd show up with a bunch of SM57s, and if I'm allowed in my budget, probably a couple U87s too.
Nice.
I'd have a pair of compressors. They don't have to be 1176s. I'd have some kind of cheap Mackie-like mixer and a pair of self-powered monitors. I think I could make almost any record I would want to make with those elements.
What would you use the Mackie-like mixer for?
Mic pre's, EQ.
Just for additional mic pre's, even though you have some built into the Universal Audio Apollo?
Yeah, probably. I'd probably defer to the Mackie mic pre's because I've used them a bunch. Mm-hmm. I've never had the occasion to A/B them against the UAD mic pre's. But yeah, I would assume like my Apollo interface only has Mine only has 2 mic pre's in it, I think.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it's either 2 or 4, but that's not enough. If you're moving to a new city and you want to record bands, you're going to need some more. So yeah, I would use it for mic pre's. I would use it for EQ, and I might well use it for mixing.
I made a lot of records with the Mackie board in my time. Great stuff. Great mic pre's. I remember one of the tricks that I learned early on was to shorten the signal chain a little bit. So I'd run a mic into a mic pre on the Mackie, and then I would half patch, or I'd patch straight out of the inserts end and go over to, I got to confess here, the ADAT at the time. But that way it was just like mic pre straight to I can't even say tape, can I? No, I can say tape. ADAT
it was tape.
There you go.
Or straight into the converter.
Straight into the converter. Well, cool, man. Thanks for bringing the Mackie back in. I've got one or two of those floating around in the studio that I refuse to part with, even though they don't get a lot of use.
Yeah, you probably aren't going to find a use for them. But if you got to go do a location thing, you want to be out in a cabin for 3 weeks with a singer-songwriter, it could be a useful thing.
I almost guarantee that if you've started using that on a session, you would quickly grow to love and appreciate this new tone that you were getting as well. I do. Every time I get a chance to do that.
There was a legitimate amount of headroom on those consoles, and when you would jam it into distorting, it would do that gradually. It was useful,
Yeah, you got a kind of a crunch. You get that mid-range you need for punk rock sometimes.
Yeah.
So now how about finding people to make music with? What would you do?
This is different for everyone, I think, but what you have to do is radiate enthusiasm for music. You have to go to shows. When you see an artist that you really enjoy, you have to talk to them and let them know. You do stuff. You look at message boards and go audition for bands and jam and collaborate. And it's going to be as a result of your enthusiasm for people and music that you start to have situations that might generate work or money.
I like that. Nobody's shared that advice yet. So another first. I like that. And then, so the money just sort of flows from the enthusiasm for music and creating opportunities. Did you have any feelings, or have you ever had any feelings about whether it's cool to, work over here washing dishes, even though you really want to be over here in the studio? Do you feel like you need to make your money work happen in and around the music as well?
There's positives and negatives for both things. When you're working another job, especially if it's not very difficult, if you're working in a cafe, or like my job when I was working at Chicago Tracks all those years ago, I was the produce guy at a health food store across the street. Not hard. I'm schlepping vegetables and making price tags and stuff. So the whole time that I'm doing my job and getting paid for it, I'm thinking about what else I can be doing and will be doing. And there's a certain part of my brain that's organizing my non-work time and making it more productive. And I think just thinking about what you're going to do when you get out of this damn place makes you really value the time that you have and makes you use it well.
Yeah, so there's truth to that.
I like that. And, conversely, when you make your living doing music, you run the very, very real risk of turning the thing that you love into a chore. And I think that there's a very high rate of professional burnout in what it is that we do. And I don't think it's talked about very much. But staying inspired and staying in love with music isn't the easiest damn thing in the world to do, especially if you're the owner of a recording facility and you have to find some way to keep those doors open and you're working on stuff that isn't maybe your favorite all the time.
Yeah, and isn't even your music all the time,
Well, it's hardly ever your music.
Yeah. Well, so it reminds me, you talk about two things. One is you're over there putting price tags on, and guess it's across the street from the studio. So guess where all the musicians are going to shop and buy their smoothies anyway.
Right.
So you were around some of the music. But two, you leave there and you're pumped to go and do some recording. And, my takeaway is you can get a lot more done in 2 enthusiastic hours in the studio than you can in 12, no enthusiasm hours in the studio.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you spend all that time planning and thinking about it, you're going to have a very keen idea of what you want to get done in that time.
Yeah. It reminds me of a sort of a rule I have for myself about doing overdubs in the studio, is that if I'm in the control room and I hear an idea and I have an idea, it's kind of like what you talked about with the adding an EQ. If you kind of think, oh, this needs this thing, and then you go out to play the overdub, it's so much more productive than if it's like, let's go noodle around on the organ and see what happens, You you lose hours and you have no idea whether you added anything good. Both work.
Totally.
But it's nice when you're inspired first and then you go after that idea.
I like intentionality. I like mistakes when they happen too, and they're useful. But if you're not constantly asking yourself, what's going to make this piece of music the most compelling it can be? If what you're doing is not in the service of answering that question, then it's going to take a lot longer to get there, and you might not get there.
Yeah. All right, so here's the last question. This one is hypothetical as well. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and Brian, you're going to go back in time and find young Brian just coming out of, was it, I apologize. Was it Northwestern? No.
I wish. It was Northern Illinois University.
Northern Illinois University. And you're going to give yourself, you tap yourself on the shoulder, you turn around, what are you doing here? And you say, well, I've come to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice would you give your young self?
Be honest with yourself. Always be honest with yourself.
Come on, man, quit lying.
No, I mean, that has been probably the biggest problem for me over the years. And I think I'm fairly over it now, but there's still times when you're tempted to accept less than awesome. When what you're trying to do is make awesome. You're trying to make timeless classics of the genre. You're not trying to make a passable drum sound and get on with it.
You're trying to make something that's as exciting as that thing that you heard in that room with those speakers that got you excited about this in the first place.
Exactly. And so, being honest with yourself is going to lead you to proper preparation. It's going to lead to real competency with your tools. It means admitting to yourself when something wasn't achieved in the studio and it's partially your fault. You have to understand why. A lot of these things have to do with personality issues and managing, like basic human resources within the context of a band and a studio staff. And it requires a lot of honesty. You don't always want to be honest with everyone around you about what it is you're thinking internally, but you got to be brutally honest with yourself.
Yeah, that's good advice, man. I like that. Well, Brian, again, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. You've shared a lot of great advice and stories and just insights into recording and life and making a lifetime of records. So I really appreciate it. Can you let the Rockstars know how they can find you, follow you, learn more about you?
Most people find me on Facebook. I'm Brian Deck on Facebook, and there is one other Brian Deck from Chicago on Facebook. So you just have to look for the older one with the grayer hair, and that's me.
Nice. I see your Skype photo. You sort of have like cool cycling glasses on or something too.
I probably hadn't slept well that night.
We'll dig it. And then Rockstars, also, we'll include links to everything we talked about with Brian in the show notes. We've got a collection of great YouTube links. So if you want to go listen to the music, it's right there. You just click right through. And you can find that at rsrockstars.com and then just search with the magnifying glass. Just type in Brian or Brian Deck and it'll take you right to the blog post. Or you can find it on your phone. And Brian had considerately suggested that we check out the RIN-M plugin. And once again, there's a link to that in the show notes as well, rsrockstars.com/RIN. And you can go get your copy and a book explaining how to use it and the importance of metadata and, building a legacy with all this music you're going to create, whether you're about to create music for 3 decades or 1 decade or whatever it is. Let's have the world have an opportunity to thank us for the work that we've done.
In dollars.
In dollars.
Well,
or at least an email,
in fractions of a cent.
Cool, man. Well, Brian, thank you so much, man. Really a pleasure. And thanks for taking me back into so much cool music in Chicago and the Midwest. It's one of my favorite places.
Thanks for having me. I'm really fun to be here. And I hope I shared something of value.
And a shout out to a couple of your other Chicago friends, Ken Sluter, who's on the podcast too, and Brad Wood. Thank you, Brad, for introducing us.
Right on. Those guys are really worth listening to. Go listen to them.
Awesome. Thanks, dude. We'll see you around the studio and talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Liz Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.